They considered it the most superfluous thing a rancher could do. In a Montana winter, build a snow wall on a windy plateau with no roof, no heater, while forecasts showed winds from the Rockies barreling down with enough force to shred metal and paralyze anything left outdoors. Ethan Caldwell did it anyway, quietly, running the bulldozer in circles, ignoring the certain shakes of heads, the looks that said tradition was enough and he was taking unnecessary risks. The pregnant cows stood behind that rough snow wall as the Montana sky turned leaden gray and the storm began pressing wind down to the ground like a verdict. What no one knew at the time was that, within a few dozen hours, that seemingly meaningless decision would become the fragile line between survival and loss, and the very people most convinced they were right would be forced to ask themselves, what exactly did Ethan see that they missed? Ethan Caldwell stood beside the bulldozer blade 3 days before the storm hit, his gloved hands resting on the freshly packed snow, feeling the cold transmit straight through the fabric into his bones. Before him stretched a high, curving arc of snow across the open ground west of the ranch, where winds from the Rockies usually swept down the valley unimpeded. The wall stood nearly 3 meters high at its center, thick and heavy, built entirely from on-site snow, each layer compressed by its own weight. It wasn't straight, didn't resemble any calculated structure on paper. At a glance, it looked like a meaningless pile of snow. Ethan's old cow dog stood a few steps away, head turned toward the murky gray sky, ears pricked, body tense. The dog had lived long enough on this land to know when the wind was about to shift. Ethan knew too. He was a middle-aged rancher, quiet, more accustomed to working in wind and snow than talking about it. His ranch sat on the Montana plateau, where winter didn't arrive with deep snowfalls so much as with cutting winds that scoured the ground, carrying cold strong enough to drain heat from anything that stayed still too long. Calving season was approaching, and nearly 60 cows were heavy with calf. For those who lived here, that wasn't just a normal calendar date. It was a tense, simmering stretch when every decision could leave consequences for the whole year. The surrounding ranches still did things the way they had for decades: low wooden sheds, tight and enclosed heaters running all night, and the belief that tradition existed because it was good enough. No one mocked Ethan when he started moving snow onto the open ground instead of repairing the sheds. Their skepticism was silent and certain, like a conclusion already drawn. It had been the same for decades, and the livestock had survived most winters. Ethan felt those looks as he drove the bulldozer, the steel blade slicing deep into the hard snow, pushing it into high blocks, turning back and packing it tight again. He wasn't building the wall to look pretty. He just needed something tall enough to cut the wind and heavy enough not to be torn apart right away. Laura, his wife, stood on the porch watching one pale afternoon when the snow wall was nearly complete. She didn't ask what he was doing. She only asked about the risks, about the possibility of collapse, about the cows getting buried if the wind shifted. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't reassure with certainties. He said he didn't know if he was right or not, but he knew one thing clearly: if he kept doing things the same way, he was handing the entire calving season over to the same kind of wind that had more than once made him open the shed door in the morning with a heavy feeling in his chest. When the snow wall was finished, Ethan shut off the machine and walked along its curves, stomping with his boots to firm up any soft spots. The wind had already sharpened, not strong yet, but enough to signal a change. Still, the kitchen radio kept issuing fresh warnings. First stronger than average winds, then whiteout risk, then temperatures dropping fast within hours. The voice was steady, but each time the alert level rose, the air in the house grew a little heavier. Ethan listened, memorized, and did his final task. He opened the side gates and slowly moved the herd toward the sheltered area behind the snow wall. They didn't understand why they had to leave their familiar spots, but instinct made them bunch together, backs to the wind. When the last cow settled, Ethan paused, looking at the white wall standing between the cattle and the howling emptiness ahead. He didn't feel confident, didn't feel relieved. What he felt was time closing in. The broadcast kept coming whiteout across the region, high winds, temperatures falling faster than predicted. Ethan went back inside as the last daylight died, not because he was reassured, but because there was nothing left to adjust. The wall was there. The cows were there. No time to fix mistakes. Only time to wait and to see whether the Montana winter would accept a decision made in silence. The storm didn't arrive with the familiar roar of heavy snow or a theatrical collapse of the sky, but in a far more precise and cold way, beginning with the wind changing direction before a single flake could touch the ground. Ethan noticed it when the wind outside the house no longer slammed straight against the walls as usual, but slid low and sharp like an invisible blade skimming the earth. The temperature dropped faster than the radio had forecast hours earlier, not gradually, but as if someone had suddenly cranked the dial too far down. The air inside the house grew dry, and heavy breaths seeming to rise more slowly. There was a very clear sense that everything was arriving a beat early that winter, wasn't waiting for its schedule to strike. When Ethan looked out the window one last time before the light vanished completely, the snow wall was just a blurred white mass, its curve blending into the solid gray sky. A few hours later, the snow wall disappeared from sight entirely. Not because it collapsed, but because the concept of visibility no longer existed. Snow didn't fall straight down. It flew sideways, dragged parallel to the ground by the wind, whipping against the glass like sand. No one could say whether the snow wall still stood or had been torn apart. Even imagining it became meaningless in that thick white blindness. Ethan's first thought wasn't fear, but the clear realization that all his calculations had ended. No more ability to intervene. No going outside without real danger. No checking the cattle, no repositioning, no reinforcement if something went wrong. Every decision had been made earlier in daylight, when the wind was still gentle enough to allow choice. Now winter held control. Ethan stood at the door for a few minutes, hand on the icy latch, listening to the wind howl across the open space behind the ranch, knowing that opening that door would bring no information beyond risk. He returned to the kitchen, and their world shrank to its literal size. Just the small room, the weak yellow lamp, the radio spitting intermittent bulletins through static, and the steady metallic rattle of corrugated panels and fences outside. Laura sat at the table, hands wrapped around a long, cold coffee mug. She asked nothing, mentioned no snow wall, asked nothing about the cows. Her silence wasn't indifference. It was the understanding that no answers existed right now. Ethan sat across from her, back straight but shoulders heavy, his ears gradually tuning to the wind's rhythm until he could pick out every small change in its sound. Occasionally, the radio reported closed roads, power outages, ranches evacuating livestock at the last minute. Each piece of news passed through the kitchen like a reminder that what was happening out there was far beyond human reach. Time stretched in a distorted way. No more day or night, just unchanging gray dark behind the window. Ethan no longer thought about whether he was right or wrong. That question had lost value. The only thing left was a simple, harsh fact: if the snow wall out there didn't do what it was built to do, there would be no backup plan. No plan B, no last-minute pivot. Winter had locked every door, and they could only sit there listening to the wind, waiting and letting time answer for a decision made in silence. Time began to stretch in an unusual way, no longer measured by the clock on the kitchen wall, but by the tiniest changes in the wind's sound and the thickness of the white curtain outside the window. The first 12 hours passed in rigid tension, when Ethan could still distinguish day from night by the faint shade of light seeping through the curtains, but by the 24-hour mark that concept dissolved entirely. The storm didn't ease. It only changed form, from violent gusts to a continuous, heavy flow, pressing snow tight against every surface and making the outside space eerily flat and still. Whiteout was no longer a radio warning. It became the unchanging reality where direction and landmarks disappeared, leaving only a thick white that covered everything. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, back straight against the chair, hands resting in front of him, and gradually realized this was the moment when every prior decision and calculation was forced to go quiet. He could do nothing more, could not check, could not repair, and could not know what was actually happening behind the snow wall. The radio remained their only fragile thread to the rest of the world, but what it brought was not reassurance. Each broken bulletin rose through the static, reporting other ranches in the area, already losing calves in the night, reporting tight wooden sheds that still couldn't hold heat when wind slipped through the smallest gaps, reporting heaters running at full capacity but unable to keep up with the rate. The wind stole warmth away. Each report was a slow cut, not directly hitting Ethan, but quietly deepening the silence between him and Laura. He didn't react strongly, didn't shake his head, didn't sigh. He just listened and noted, as if those stories were necessary data points for a problem that no longer had a solution. In Ethan's mind, there was no self-affirming question. He didn't ask why he was right, didn't look for any sign to believe the snow wall would save them. The only question that repeated slow and persistent was whether he had missed something. Some corner of wind he hadn't accounted for, some small terrain change that could create a deadly eddy behind the wall, some layer of snow too heavy that could bring the barrier down at the worst possible moment. He pictured the snow wall out there now completely invisible, no longer a solid shape but only a fragile assumption standing between the cattle and the storm. It might still be standing, or it might have been hollowed at the base by wind or bent under snow weight, creating a lethal vortex behind it. He pictured the newborn calves, tiny bodies pressed against their mothers, weak breaths mingling with the frigid air, and wondered if that snow layer was enough to cut the wind or only made everything worse. There was no evidence to confirm or refute any of those scenarios. No particular sound carried back from the ranch to signal safety or disaster. Only the wind, steady and emotionless, kept blowing. Laura stayed there occasionally, rising to pour more hot water, but never asking, never trying to pull Ethan from his thoughts. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was a tacit agreement that any words right now would only expose their helplessness. Time kept moving, passing the 36-hour mark, and the storm still hadn't left, only shifting from fierce assault to relentless pressure, wearing everything down. The radio bulletins began to thin out, not because things were improving, but because there wasn't much new to report. Every ranch was experiencing the same reality, and outcomes could only be verified after the storm passed. Ethan realized one thing more clearly than ever. The most terrifying part of this moment wasn't the possibility of failure, but the waiting with no sign to cling to. He couldn't know if he had done enough, couldn't know if the decision to build the snow wall had truly made a difference, or if it was just another variable in a winter that was already brutal. When the wind finally began to weaken, not with a sudden drop, but with short pauses between gusts, Ethan didn't feel relief. No one in that kitchen felt joy, because both understood that the coming silence wasn't the answer. It was only the condition for the answer to appear. The worst, if it came, would only be known when the storm had fully passed, when the door was opened, and when whatever remained outside was no longer hidden by wind and snow. When the wind finally began to retreat, not with a clear sign, but with longer pauses between gusts, Ethan stood up before the radio could confirm anything. He put on his coat, pulled his hat low, opened the door, and stepped out, letting the lingering cold slap straight into his face like a reminder that winter hadn't fully left. The snow was deep enough that each step had to be lifted slowly, body leaning forward to keep balance, and the surrounding landscape looked distorted, as if someone had squeezed the entire valley in their fist. Fences no longer stood straight. Wooden posts leaned in the same direction. Familiar objects turned strange under layers of wind-packed snow, formed into hard, sharp ridges. Ethan looked toward the snow wall and took several seconds to recognize its shape. The snow wall was no longer the neat curved band he had left when he went inside. Parts had been hollowed out by wind, the top edge sagging in sections, the surface pitted and eroded without mercy, but it still stood. It hadn't collapsed, hadn't been torn into meaningless piles. More importantly, behind that wall the wind suddenly weakened, not disappearing entirely, but enough to create a distinct quiet zone, a pocket of air where the wind no longer drove straight into bodies. Ethan took a few more steps, feeling the difference with his own body, before he saw the cattle. They were there, bunched behind the snow wall, backs turned to the wind bodies covered in dry snow. Not all stood firm like in some perfect picture. A few cows looked exhausted, legs trembling slightly after hours of bracing. Some calves lay closer to the ground than usual, fur wet and matted with ice, but they were alive. Ethan stopped observing more closely, as if he didn't dare believe what he was seeing. The calves breathed steadily, chests rising slow but stable, a few trying to stand on wobbly legs, swaying but not falling. There was no chaos, no motionless bodies scattered across the snow, like the haunting fear he had carried through many winters. Just life, fragile and imperfect, but still present. Ethan felt a long breath escape his chest, not a sigh of relief, but an unconscious reflex of a body that had been rigid for hours. He didn't raise his arms to the sky, didn't say a word, didn't turn back to call Laura out to see immediately. No sense of triumph surged up. What he felt was only a very small easing somewhere deep inside, accompanied by the awareness that everything could still have gone worse if just one detail had been different. The snow wall out there didn't defeat winter. It didn't make the storm disappear, didn't turn the Montana Plateau into a gentler place. It did only one thing, but it was enough. It made winter less cruel in exactly the space and time it needed to be. Ethan stood there a little longer, the cold wind still whipping his back but no longer cutting straight through him, as before, watching the cattle gradually settle, watching the wounded but unbowed snow wall, and understanding that the truth after this storm wasn't a miracle but the result of a choice that promised nothing beyond a chance to survive. After Ethan returned to the house and shed the heavy coat, still carrying the smell of snow, the radio continued with more fragmented reports than before. But this time the voice wasn't rushed with warnings. It shifted to dry, heavy updates. Ranches in the area began tallying losses as soon as the wind eased enough for them to open shed doors. No one called it a disaster on the air, no sensational words, just numbers read slowly ranch by ranch. Lost 2 calves the first night. Lost 4 when the wind shifted. Some places lost nearly the entire early crop. Those numbers didn't shout, didn't need emphasis, but they carried a weight that made Ethan's small kitchen feel colder even with the heater still running. Ethan sat still, listening, not taking notes, not reacting. He didn't need much imagination to know what the scene looked like behind those wooden shed doors. He had stood in that position in past winters, bending down beside a small, still body, wondering if he had done enough. No one in those reports was called careless. No one was blamed. Those ranches had done exactly what they had done for decades, following what was considered reasonable and safe. Tight sheds, heaters at full capacity, doors sealed shut. But the wind had slipped through the smallest cracks, carried heat away faster than any equipment could replace it, and tradition in that moment didn't save them. What struck Ethan most wasn't the numbers, but the silences between them. No accusations came over the radio, no anger, no public lament. A familiar silence blanketed the reports, the silence of ranchers who understood that nature owes no explanations. As the wind eased further and roads slowly cleared, a few pickup trucks drove slowly past Ethan's ranch. No one stopped. No one got out to ask or check. The men in the cabs only glanced over their eyes, flicking quickly toward the snow wall, still standing there warped and chipped, then looking away. They didn't ask Ethan how he did it. They didn't stare at the snow wall longer than necessary, as if looking too closely would force them to face uncomfortable questions about what they had believed was enough. Ethan didn't go out to explain, nor did he try to avoid them. He continued his daily work, checking the cattle, repairing wind-tilted fences, doing what needed doing after the storm like every other ranch. The only difference was that here there were still calves left to check. Laura noticed the calls to the house were far fewer than in previous winters. Not because people didn't know what had happened, but because no one was ready to say it out loud. The certainty that had bound them for years was beginning to show its price, and that price didn't need to be spoken. It was present in the emptier sheds and the flattened patches of ground without tiny hoofprints, and in the new caution with which people passed Ethan's ranch, as if between them and that snow wall there wasn't just physical distance, but a gap between what they had once believed and what had just occurred. In the days after the storm, as snow began to settle and roads gradually reopened, the truth didn't spread through official bulletins or direct calls, but through small remarks exchanged at a safe distance. It started very slowly, almost invisibly, in feed stores, at gas stations, in brief conversations around steaming coffee urns. "Heard Caldwell didn't lose any calves," someone would say, voice low enough not to become a declaration. No details, no confirmation, just a floating piece of information passed along without anyone fully taking responsibility. Those who heard didn't argue, but they didn't agree either. They gave a slight nod or changed the subject as if the story wasn't solid enough to keep in mind. No one called what happened at Ethan's ranch a solution. The word wasn't used. Instead, they chose a much easier term: luck. Lucky the snow wall didn't collapse. Lucky the wind didn't shift again. Lucky his cattle were in the right spot at the right time. That label made everything simpler, because if it was luck, no one had to re-examine what they had trusted for years. Ethan wasn't present in those conversations, but he knew they were happening. He felt it in the way people looked at him when they met by chance on the road, their eyes lingering a moment longer before quickly turning away, as if afraid that looking too closely would force them to ask a question they weren't ready to hear answered. No one came to his ranch to see the snow wall openly. No one asked how he had calculated it or why he chose that spot. Curiosity existed, but it stayed behind a thick shield of habit and pride. Ethan didn't break that distance on his own. He didn't call neighbors to recount what he had done, didn't offer advice, didn't say they should try something different next winter. He understood that truth, if it had weight, would find its own way, and forcing others to acknowledge it too soon would only make them resist harder. Laura noticed the small changes in how people behaved: shorter greetings, less smiling, as if the whole community was carrying an unspoken question. In the region's small gatherings, when the storm was mentioned, people focused on wind speeds, snowfall amounts, the unusual severity of that winter. If someone slipped and mentioned Caldwell's ranch, the air changed instantly. The topic was deflected or ended with a shrug. "He just got lucky," someone would say, and the others nodded as if that was the most reasonable conclusion. That word luck became a safe cushion, allowing them to avoid facing the possibility that something in their long-standing methods might no longer be sufficient. Ethan heard those whispers through others, through stray fragments of talk, and he didn't react. He kept working, repairing what the storm had damaged, tending the cattle and the calves that were gradually getting stronger. But deep down he knew the truth had begun to spread slowly and cautiously. It was like cold seeping through thick layers of clothing, at first almost unnoticeable, but once it reached the skin, impossible to ignore. And though no one was ready to name it yet, that truth existed, waiting for the day the community could no longer comfortably call it luck. After a few weeks, when the storm story was no longer hot news but shared memory, a very small shift began to appear in how people talked about winter, even if no one put it into words. At neighboring ranches, conversations no longer stopped at how low the temperature dropped or how long heaters had to run. They started turning to details rarely noticed before. They talked about wind direction during the storm night, how it didn't blow straight but swirled and shifted with the terrain, about open stretches where wind could accelerate before hitting the sheds. Someone mentioned the feeling of standing outside after the storm just a few meters off, and the wind felt completely different, stronger or calmer in ways that were hard to explain. Those stories didn't mention Ethan or the snow wall directly, but they carried clear traces of a new way of looking. A few ranchers began walking their land more, not to fix sheds or check fences, but to observe. They stood on low rises, watching the wind pour down the valley, trying to feel where the air compressed, where it was released. The open terrain of the Montana Plateau, once taken for granted, was now seen as an active factor that could amplify or soften winter's impact. They talked about sheltered pockets behind structures, natural windbreaks formed between low hills or sparse tree lines, and began wondering why they hadn't paid attention to them before. Those questions didn't challenge tradition, at least not on the surface. They were asked carefully, as if people were taking small steps across thin ice. Ethan heard these changes in brief conversations when he met neighbors by chance in half-finished remarks at the feed store. No one asked him directly, but their eyes were different. They no longer looked at him as someone who got lucky, but as someone who had noticed something they had overlooked. Ethan didn't explain, didn't seize the chance to convince anyone. He knew real change doesn't come from proving results, but from changing the questions asked. And those questions were now appearing. Gradually, a simple but hard-to-accept realization began forming in the community. The problem wasn't the temperature. Montana winters are always cold. That never changes. What kills livestock isn't the number on the thermometer, but wind that isn't cut, wind that continuously steals heat before bodies can hold it. Looking back at the tight wooden sheds, people started to see that they were designed to resist cold, not to break wind flow. Heaters could generate warmth, but couldn't stop wind from carrying it away. The sheltered space behind Ethan's snow wall, though no one named it, became a quiet, haunting image, proof that just changing the wind's path could make a difference. No one declared they had been wrong, but the silence when mentioning the storm carried a new tone, heavier, more thoughtful. The way people looked at winter was shifting bit by bit, from accepting it as an unbeatable force to trying to understand how it works. And in that slow shift, the snow wall was no longer just a temporary mass of snow that melted with the season, but an open question hanging in the cold air of the plateau. If wind could be cut, how many other things had they overlooked simply because they were too used to the cold? The change in perspective didn't immediately turn into action, but as winter lingered and the next cold fronts kept sweeping across the plateau, some ranches began trying something different, cautiously and without fanfare. At first they were small moves, almost experiments at ranches far from main roads where no one would notice too much. A few ranchers used bulldozers to push snow into higher piles than usual on the windward side, not calling them walls, just seeing it as a way to keep snow from blowing entirely into open fields. Those early barriers weren't uniform, nor did they copy Ethan's wall. Some were too low, some built straight like a dike, some placed in the wrong direction, forcing wind to pile up instead of curve away. Results weren't always positive. Some ranches found that wind only needed a gap to slip through, creating cold eddies behind that made cattle suffer more than before. Some piled snow too thick at the base, causing part of the structure to collapse after one strong night. Those mistakes weren't hidden, but they weren't shouted about either. They became silent lessons, exchanged in short talks when two pickups stopped side by side on snow-covered roads. Gradually, ranchers began adjusting. They changed the angle of the barriers, curved them with the terrain instead of forcing straight lines. They left space behind, not too narrow to compress the wind, not too wide to lose effect. Some tried combining snow piles with sparse tree lines, using what was already there, instead of copying anyone's exact model. No one mentioned Ethan's name while doing these things, but his influence was clear in how they observed and experimented. Each new snow wall was different, reflecting the land it stood on and the rancher's own understanding of wind. Some ranches still failed, losing a few calves before finding the right configuration, while others saw better results from the start. But the common ground was that they no longer saw blocking wind as pointless. The community didn't hold formal meetings, didn't issue recommendations or guidelines. The shift happened quietly through observation and constant adjustment. When another strong wind swept through late in the season, some ranches noticed their cattle endured better, not because the weather was milder, but because the wind had been redirected before reaching them. Those snow walls weren't built as symbols of innovation, but as practical experiments that could be erased when spring arrived. Yet their scattered appearance across the Montana plateau, each with a slightly different shape and purpose, showed that the story had moved beyond one individual decision. It had become a collective learning process, slow and imperfect, where the community began accepting that there was more than one way to face winter, and that sometimes temporary solutions made of snow opened up more enduring ones in how people understand and live with cold wind. When winter finally began to withdraw, it didn't do so with a clear moment or a specific day people could mark on a calendar, but with the slow, uneven melting of snow across the plateau. At first, only small trickles of water ran along paths, then patches of brown earth appeared among the gray-white drifts, and finally the familiar smell of damp mud signaled the return of spring. Ethan watched that change in silence, continuing his daily rancher work, as if the past winter had been just another phase to get through, not a story to retell. The snow wall, which had once stood firm between wind and cattle, began to soften its sharp edges, rounding its height, decreasing day by day. No one dismantled it, no one tore it down. It simply melted, returned to water, and soaked into the ground as if it had never existed. The hollows and sags on its surface disappeared first, then the thick core that had borne the most wind pressure. Within a few weeks, the entire structure was gone from the landscape, leaving no physical trace that a temporary barrier had once stood there. The open ground west of the ranch returned to its natural state, flat, expansive, ready for new winds in future seasons. The cattle gradually spread out as the weather warmed, the calves growing fur, thickening, walking more steadily on wet ground. Ethan passed the area where the snow wall had been, without stopping, without looking longer than necessary. He didn't feel loss when it vanished, nor did he try to preserve anything as a memory. For him, the value of the snow wall had never been in its lasting presence, but in what it had done in exactly the time it was needed. As neighboring ranches also entered the rhythm of spring, the snow wall story was mentioned less. People returned to talking about new grass, water machinery repairs, and preparations for warmer months. The tension of winter gave way to other familiar concerns. Yet in the way they looked at the surrounding landscape, there was a subtle change. Open stretches of ground were no longer just useless space, but factors to consider. Wind direction was no longer a minor detail in weather talk, but a variable to remember. Winter retreated, taking its storms and snow, but it left behind something intangible that couldn't melt like the snow wall. No physical evidence remained to point to what had happened, no structure, no trace, only memories and a new way of seeing the land they lived on. The story at this stage was allowed to breathe, not pushed forward by tension or consequence, but settling like ground after frost, preparing for whatever would come next. When winter finally began to withdraw, it didn't do so with a clear moment or a specific day people could mark on a calendar, but with the slow, uneven melting of snow across the plateau. At first, only small trickles of water ran along paths, then patches of brown earth appeared among the gray-white drifts, and finally the familiar smell of damp mud signaled the return of spring. Ethan watched that change in silence, continuing his daily rancher work as if the past winter had been just another phase to get through, not a story to retell. The snow wall, which had once stood firm between wind and cattle, began to soften its sharp edges, rounding its height, decreasing day by day. No one dismantled it, no one tore it down. It simply melted, returned to water, and soaked into the ground as if it had never existed. The hollows and sags on its surface disappeared first, then the thick core that had borne the most wind pressure. Within a few weeks, the entire structure was gone from the landscape, leaving no physical trace that a temporary barrier had once stood there. The open ground west of the ranch returned to its natural state, flat, expansive, ready for new winds in future seasons. The cattle gradually spread out as the weather warmed, the calves growing fur, thickening, walking more steadily on wet ground. Ethan passed the area where the snow wall had been without stopping, without looking longer than necessary. He didn't feel loss when it vanished, nor did he try to preserve anything as a memory. For him, the value of the snow wall had never been in its lasting presence, but in what it had done in exactly the time it was needed. As neighboring ranches also entered the rhythm of spring, the snow wall story was mentioned less. People returned to talking about new grass, water machinery repairs, and preparations for warmer months. The tension of winter gave way to other familiar concerns. Yet in the way they looked at the surrounding landscape there was a subtle change. Open stretches of ground were no longer just useless space, but factors to consider. Wind direction was no longer a minor detail in weather talk, but a variable to remember. Winter retreated, taking its storms and snow, but it left behind something intangible that couldn't melt like the snow wall. No physical evidence remained to point to what had happened, no structure, no trace, only memories and a new way of seeing the land they lived on. The story at this stage was allowed to breathe, not pushed forward by tension or consequence, but settling like ground after frost, preparing for whatever would come next. When calving season reached its final days, the Montana Plateau had put on a different appearance, quiet and more familiar, as if what happened last winter had been only a temporary ripple on the surface of ranch life. The early-born calves were now bigger, their fur thick and clean, walking steadily behind their mothers on newly sprouted grass. They carried no sign of the white wind nights that had tested their existence, and that made the story even harder to grasp. The snow wall, once the center of every thought and worry, now existed only in memory. It had never been a permanent structure, and when it melted, it left no physical trace to prove it had ever stood there. The only thing that remained wasn't in the snow, but in the way people in the community looked back at the winter just past. Conversations about weather had changed tone, no longer just familiar talk of cold and harshness, but now laced with subtler remarks about wind, open terrain, and small decisions that could make big differences at critical moments. No one declared they had completely changed their ways, nor did anyone deny that tradition had carried them through generations. But somewhere amid daily work, a new space had opened where old assumptions were no longer accepted absolutely. Calving season ended without celebration or formal summary. It closed the way other seasons close, with numbers recorded in ledgers. Animals moved to the next stage of care and life, returning to its normal rhythm. But normal now carried a different meaning. The idea once seen as unnecessary, even superfluous, was no longer dismissed outright when mentioned. It didn't become the new standard, nor was it celebrated as the only solution. It existed as a tested choice that had left its mark. Ethan watched the calves grow without thinking about the snow wall anymore. He didn't see it as what saved them, nor did he assign it a decisive role. For him, the snow wall was just snow, a temporary material used at a specific moment. What truly changed was how he and gradually those around him looked at winter. It was no longer an absolute force people could only endure, but a system that could be observed, questioned, and partially adjusted if understood deeply enough. As calving season closed and the plateau moved into warmer days, the remaining lesson wasn't hung up as a slogan, wasn't repeated like a moral reminder. It rested quietly in the way people thought about the next winter, in the slow but real readiness to question what everyone had long believed was enough. Not something strange saved them, but the willingness to question a certainty that had existed too long. If you find this story worth reflecting on, please subscribe to the channel to keep following other stories about people, nature, and the quiet decisions that make a difference. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I'll see you in the next story.